My favorite thing about Marvel's Spider-Man is the ending. Hey folks, and welcome to my critique on Marvel's Spider-Man. I'm playing the Enhanced Edition on the PS5 that includes all the DLC. Now this video will be why I think the ending is the strongest part of the game, with some offshoot tangents where I discuss what I think about the combat, the web swinging, and the side quests. Obviously, because I'm talking about the ending, there will be spoilers, so watch at your own discretion. Afterwards, I'll let you know what game I'm critiquing next on the channel. So sit back and enjoy as I explain my thoughts and feelings having played through Marvel's Spider-Man. What makes an ending resonate? I think it's about payoff. For the ending of a story to have emotional weight, the story itself has to adequately set up the characters, stakes, and emotion that will pay off by the final moments. This is tricky enough to do in most video games, where the player is given freedom to pursue objectives outside the main story, or the gameplay itself acting as a buffer between dramatic moments. But what makes Marvel's Spider-Man a marvel for successfully landing its narrative is that it's also an open world. As a player, I can ignore the next story mission displayed on my map to go off and complete other objectives. I can do this for hours. It's a big criticism of the open world format for any game trying to tell a story in its sandbox. How can a plot have any sense of urgency when the player doesn't have to engage immediately with anything occurring in it? Spider-Man tries to handle this in a couple of ways, neither of which I think are successful. One is to have sections of open world gameplay where the plot settles down, and Spider-Man has time to swing through the city, foiling criminals, and removing markers from the minimap. The reason I don't think these moments work is that the next main mission appears after only a couple minutes of being left alone. I understand that there are players who just want to progress through the story, so you couldn't leave them alone in New York for too long, but it undercuts the idea of letting the player explore and engage with the activities of the open world, or the enjoyment of swinging around the city for its own sake. The second way Spider-Man handles balancing the urgency of the plot with the cavalier attitude an open world provides is through the story itself. Now, to explain this, I'll tell you how I tried to tackle Spider-Man's open world by first explaining what didn't work for me. There was a single play session where I tried to clear out every icon in one of the city zones, and I had a terrible time. Focusing solely on the side content felt like I was ticking items off a checklist, and it soured me on the game. What made the side activities exciting, aside from most only taking a couple of minutes to complete, was seeing where the next mission marker was, and then tracking a straight line to it in my head and completing all the map icons along the way. That kept the activities fresh because I was enjoying them for their own sake, as part of the journey towards a larger goal. That idea of a larger goal is why I engaged with most of the side activities in the first place. They had a story, simplistic as it may be. I wanted to help Harry keep his research stations open, or find out what Black Cat was up to. The landmarks were a cool way to showcase the open world, if only for a moment, and chasing down the pigeons was for a good cause. Even the bases, my most disliked side activity, had narrative tied to it in the DLC, when I was venturing underground to retrieve Sable supplies for this teacher-turned-mercenary. To me, this reveals that I need only the teensiest dollop of narrative to get me to engage with the game's side content, if I don't find it mechanically satisfying on its own. And yet so many games I've played during my life have failed to provide even that. But returning to the idea of balancing main missions and side quests, there were moments in the story that were so impactful, I wanted to know what would happen next. I rushed right over to the map marker, ignoring any side content in the vicinity, unless of course a crime got reported as I was heading to said marker. Before I touch on crimes, I should mention that relying on the strength of the narrative to push the player forward is not going to work with everyone. Forget players who don't care about the story. Whether or not a dramatic moment resonates with anyone is going to be completely subjective. While I think the ending of the game is an achievement, and yes, we will get to why, others might not. It might come off as too melodramatic, or they don't care about the characters, or dozens of other reasons. So, while I think Spider-Man doesn't succeed in balancing these competing design structures of the main story missions and the open world, the side activities at least try to tie themselves to upgrades to be useful and sought after by the player, if that dollop of narrative motivation doesn't get the job done. Spider-Man echoes a lot of 2010's game design by having 3 skill trees that the player spends experience on to gain new abilities. Early on, I enjoyed looking at the skill trees every time I had spare points to spend to buy an ability that felt like it would make battle just a little easier. But it didn't take long before I was spending points to fill out the rest of the tree for a sense of completion. I felt similarly with the gadget upgrades, spending tokens improving those that I favored in combat before eventually buying everything else. The difference with the gadgets is that in the DLC I was still experimenting with their utility in each new combat encounter, so upgrading the ones I didn't favor ended up helping me when I finally understood their potential. A good example is the trip mines. When the game introduces them, it's in a Predator section, where you can sneak around and take out guards that are on their own. The trip mine is a way to set up traps for patrolling baddies, and since I prefer to distract guards with webs and use the quick takedown button as my one-stop shop for clearing an area, I never had any reason to use them. That was until I found myself completing Screwball's combat challenges that restrict your gadget use. Combining the trip mines with the suspension matrix to whip the baddie stuck in the air down to the ground with excessive force is a great way to clear out a group of goons. Now that I think of it, most of the gadgets have crowd control utility, and they all have optimal situations to use them in. I think the combat is built around the gadgets. It's just when panicked in the heat of a fight, it's easy to default to the couple of gadgets that always work and forget about how useful everything else is. And using gadgets is on top of every other skill Spidey has at his disposal. One reason it took me so long to rely on the power of the gadgets was my love of using finishers. Spidey's suit has the power to fill the focus meter faster, but even when I swapped that to a suit power that webbed everyone in a 10-foot radius, I found I was building focus without trying. One finisher would lead to another, and then either a normal flurry of attacks and dodges, throwing a piece of the environment at a goon, or putting some gadgets to good use would mean a new round of finishers was ready to go. Early on, I bought the suit ability that finishers would replenish gadgets, and this created a positive feedback loop of focusing on finishers at the expense of everything else. But once I realized how useful gadgets were for keeping combat manageable, the Demon and Sable bases being a good example of how quickly combat can get out of hand if a player isn't careful, I felt like I was using Spider-Man to his full potential. Allow me to go on yet another tangent to talk about playing as an iconic superhero, and how demoralizing that can be early on as I was learning how to control him. I remember this being a bigger issue in the PS2 era, but do you ever recall playing an action game where the character would do something badass in a cutscene and you wish the game allowed you the ability to do something even half as cool? I feel we're at a point in terms of animation and game design where that's no longer the case. The way Spidey dodges attacks, finishes off an enemy, or swings through the air looks amazingly effortless. It was a joy to watch the character respond to my prompts all the way to the end of the DLC. It only got better as I gained more confidence and mastery with the game's systems, but the game had the opposite effect in my first few hours. It's to be expected that a new player is going to make mistakes, even someone accustomed to third-person open-world action games. Each game is its own island, and while many share similar design philosophies and control schemes, each one feels different to play, and it can take multiple plays of a game until a player feels truly competent expressing themselves using the controls and systems available. I think that's why the games that I love make me want to restart them immediately after they finish. I want to start the game with the same mastery I ended it with. Now everyone talks about how Spider-Man is their favorite superhero, and it's cliché of me to say the same thing, but Spider-Man is my favorite superhero. You can now all gasp at this revelation, but it means something when I'm fumbling around trying to learn how to play this video game power fantasy of controlling the web slinger. Seeing this beloved superhero fail to swing around the city gracefully or succumb to a squad of henchmen in combat felt awful. It's not just that I made mistakes while learning how to play Marvel's Spider-Man and it didn't feel good, it's that I made Spider-Man look like a chump, and it undercut the whole fantasy of playing the damn game in the first place. One of the reasons I think learning how to utilize the gadgets in combat and getting into the swing of the game's rhythm is difficult is there's so many options the player has at their disposal at every moment of play. It leads to each combat encounter feeling different, even if core strategies remain the same, because like the superhero we're controlling, we have to adapt and think on the fly to the flow of new information that may be interrupting the plan we were about to execute. But it's not just that this amount of choice and mechanical freedom can be overwhelming. Button mashing in a panic does no good. The player needs to be precise with what action they wish to perform next, but with all the options available, it's easy to forget or neglect a large amount of possible better options, either because I've forgotten about them in the moment, or I default to what has already worked, such as the base attacks and finishers. I didn't use the electric web or trip mines until the game forced me to, showing me what's great about them, and I always forgot about punching a foe into the air or flinging debris into the distance. I wonder if the Fisk mission at the beginning of the game is to blame. It throws most of the combat options at the player quickly, in room after room. It's one thing to give a player many options to develop their own unique fighting style, and it's another to overwhelm them, forgetting what's available so they hamstring themselves for the rest of the game. I feel Marvel's Spider-Man leans towards the latter, but what about the web swinging? Web swinging through New York City is another pillar of the Spider-Man fantasy. It's the first thing the player does after Peter exits his apartment. It's the first tutorial, and because of how early it's taught, I'm a bit embarrassed it took me so long to feel comfortable with it. A lot of critiques out there talk about how they felt the web swinging was too simplistic, and they wanted a system with at least more nuance. Never mind that I think anything more complex would ruin that feeling of being Spider-Man that the game is working so hard to achieve. But since I had difficulties with this simple web swinging, it's the reason why that leads me to think maybe these critics are right, but in the wrong way. Let me try and explain. Here's the swinging controls as I understand them. Press and hold the swing button and Spidey will attach his web to something and start swinging. If you don't release the button, he'll let go at the absolute height of his arc. You can press jump to interrupt this arc, to leap forward to start a new arc, and letting go of the swing button will use the momentum of the current swing. Finally, you have the web zip, which is when the jump button is tapped in midair, giving a short boost forward. This is great for changing direction. There's flourishes like holding jump when zipping towards a vantage point to fling off it, or being able to jump over buildings in a single bound, which is the wrong superhero. But this is all that is needed to be able to enjoy the thrill of swinging around New York as Spider-Man. My difficulties began the same as most players. As I said in the last section, when you're unfamiliar with a system, it takes time to get comfortable with it. You can see the difference between how I'm swinging around in the first moments of the game to how I'm swinging around in the final session of the DLC. I definitely improved along the way, but here's where I think the critics are right in that the simplicity harms the experience, and it's not because swinging around town without friction becomes boring. The game never expects a player to come to terms with even such a simple system because it does so much of the heavy lifting for them. What happens though when the game wants us to use this system to speedily chase down bad guys or swing with finesse? Anytime I had to swing with speed or precision, the fantasy fell apart. Web zip and hitting jump to get that momentum boost only seemed to do so much. Trying to chase down a car was annoying, but that's mostly because there seemed to be a discrepancy to when the prompt would appear to land on the roof, and it wasn't always related to my distance from it. The Taskmaster drone chases were a nightmare. I was lucky to hit even one of the blue bonus areas while tailing the damn thing. There was that research station that put heavy restrictions on swinging arcs, which is something I felt I had no control over. And then there's the screwball challenges from the DLC. Not only the ones where you have to swing from location to location, hitting the photobombs on the way, but her boss fight where you have to chase her around the city, while hitting all the photobombs along the way, was even worse. Now yes, this could easily be a skill issue, but I'd argue it's not my fault because the game never taught me how to use these systems with any finesse. And I think due to how simple they are, that's not something that could have happened anyway. Sure, a lot of the examples I mentioned are side content, but as stated earlier, even the slightest narrative seasoning on these activities made me want to complete them, no matter how annoying I found the actual gameplay. Maybe there just isn't a good answer for this. I love the swinging through the city. It truly makes me feel like Spider-Man and has just enough button presses to make it feel like I'm making decisions. If it was any more complicated, that feeling may have been lost. But on the other hand, I was hamstrung when the game wanted me to utilize the swinging in a more complex way. Maybe it's 'cause I never got bored with traveling through the city, taking in all the sights and sounds. If I had, I might have experimented with the limits of the system, or at least seen how many tricks I can pull off. While I did make use of the fast travel system, it was only to hop from one end of the city to another, or when I finally finished mopping up most of the side activities and didn't feel like responding to the police scanner on local crimes anymore. The crime system can sure be annoying, but I like that it makes the player feel the pull between being Peter Parker and Spider-Man. We took a detour, but we're back to talking about crimes. The discussion on the ending will follow shortly. The dichotomy between Peter Parker and Spider-Man has always been his failure to balance the mundanity of life with the exhilaration and importance of being a superhero. How can relationships, jobs, and even rent compare to saving lives? I think the crimes system and the push and pull of the side activities versus the main plot gives the player a small window into this feeling. The player is constantly pulled in two directions, and while crimes are no doubt a side activity, they feel separate from all the others. I can't tell you the amount of times I was heading to a main mission or a side activity when the police scanner chimed in, and I noticed the crime in question was either on the way or close enough that I might as well do it. They're not as quick to complete as the backpacks or landmarks, but they're usually only a couple of minutes, and often involve combat, so why not? It feels like the crimes are the Peter Parker of playing Marvel's Spider-Man. They're not as exciting as all the other things to do, and they keep interrupting at the most inopportune times, but this would be Spider-Man's normal day-to-day when a villain isn't causing havoc, patrolling the rooftops and making the streets safer. He is your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man after all. Really, it's just one more open-world interruption to get in the way of telling a good narrative, that Marvel's Spider-Man deftly avoids. In fact, I think the messiness of the open world might have worked in its favor. Starting this video off, I said that an ending works when the story has spent its runtime setting itself up. It's finally time to start talking about the story and ending. Last chance to avoid spoilers. One thing I loved about this game as a lapsed Spider-Man fan is I got to see how Insomniac used all the characters I remember fondly in new and interesting ways. I love that Norman Osborn is the mayor, and that we find Peter working for Dr. Octavius. We meet Aunt May and hear from J. Jonah Jameson over the airwaves. Even the introduction of Miles and how that story played out was amazing, as the only interaction I've had with him is the Spider-Verse movies. I'd never encountered Yuri or Martian Lee before, and I thought the game had a wonderful approach to MJ despite the stealth sections. But it's working for Octavius where I have to begin. Doc Ock is my favorite Spider-Man villain. From the moment Peter enters the lab and interacts with Otto, I knew that eventually we would get Doc Ock, but seeing that the plot focused on the demons and their obsession with Norman Osborn, Otto was put on the back burner. We also don't interact with the lab that much. There's a couple tests, there's when Otto gets his funding pulled, and there's when he's found new financiers, which feature military and security contracts. We see him going down a darker path, but I had no idea what the catalyst would be. Then the breakout at the prison happens. The reveal of not only Doc Ock, but the entire Sinister Six is something that I should have seen coming. Most of these villains only show up at the prison, but that whole sequence is such an exhilarating rush of action that I wasn't thinking about why these particular villains were making an appearance. It's too perfect. It brings back Mr. Negative, who seemed almost too easy to put away after what a threat the story built him up to be, and now the entire city was under attack by 5 dangerous adversaries, a crazed genius leading them, and a virus that could easily wipe out everyone. Talk about raising the stakes for the final act of the game. What follows is a hallucinogenic sequence, which the like of pop up in far too many open world games, fighting the Sinister Six in 2 double-team boss fights, a final showdown with Martian Lee, and then the point of no return. Peter crafts a new Spidey suit and goes to confront Otto at the top of Oscorp Tower. The fight is a true spectacle. The final flurry on the side of the building is a highlight, even if Spider-Man dodging the same way each time reminds me that I'm playing a video game. It doesn't destroy the mood though, because here the emotional immersion far outweighs the mechanical immersion. Otto is a genius, and he reveals to Peter that he always knew he was Spider-Man. Instantly, my mind goes back to the scene where Otto acts like he thinks Peter just made Spider-Man's gear. But of course he's smarter than that. Maybe he was already walking down his dark path at this point. I think Peter has similar thoughts, because he sees this as a betrayal. He can't handle that his idol would manipulate him, hurting so many people for a chance to get revenge on Norman. This culminates in the final scene between the two, where I thought Otto was feigning weakness to attempt one final attack on Peter, but no. The scene was simply Peter pouring out his despair of how much he looked up to what Otto represented and how it's all been torn down. It makes the choice Peter has to make in the next scene even more devastating. Spider-Man always does the right thing, even when it's difficult. That doesn't mean there's no conflict, and we see Peter almost fail this test, to doom an entire city to save Aunt May. But in the end, this is why he's a hero. No matter the cost, he uses his power for good. After having to grapple with a mentor who failed to live up to Peter's ideals, the ending of the game hits even stronger, and the post-credit sequence makes me wonder how Norman will fail these ideals in either the sequel or a future game. His approach to science and business was to blame for what Otto and Martian Lee became after all. But let's think back to those few scenes we got to spend with Otto and Peter. It's like a check-in. So much has been going on in the game that when we get the call from Otto to come back to the lab to continue this plotline, I always went, "Oh yeah, Otto, I wonder what will happen this time." The open world has a danger of diluting a game's story because the player is being pulled away from it to spend time doing other things. With as many threads as Marvel's Spider-Man attempted to weave with Norman, the demons, MJ and Peter, Aunt May and Feast, Miles, the Sinister Six, and finally Doc Ock and Devil's Breath, I'm amazed the game didn't collapse under its own weight. That I think it succeeded in telling its story, and that the story ended so strongly is astonishing. I said earlier that a good ending requires the story to set itself up over its runtime. How then did a game pulled in so many directions accomplish this? Even the side activities have narrative threads, so that's even more plates that are kept spinning in the air. It's exhausting to keep track of, and yet somehow it all works. I alluded earlier that the open world might be the reason why. Like Peter Parker, the player is pulled in so many directions that aside from the core systems of the game, nothing overstays its welcome. When we check in with Aunt May, help Miles, or spend more time with Otto, it endears us to these characters not only because it's been a while since we've last seen them, but because they're good people that both Peter and the player enjoy spending time with. It's an oasis in the desert of endless superhero conflict and open world content. For those of us that know Otto from the movies, comics, or other media, interactions with him stick in our mind because we're waiting for his transformation into Doc Ock. And for the players who don't have that information, his reveal as the mastermind behind everything and the betrayal Peter feels in the final showdown would hit harder, because the player might also feel betrayed to have such a good person in the story who we enjoyed spending time with fall to the dark side. A person whose actions led to the death of Aunt May and countless others. I think a final boss has to be someone who means something to the player character for it to be successful. Mechanics are great, but it's the emotion between these competing ideologies and having our protagonist emerge victorious that keeps these encounters in our memory. Someone wanting to destroy the world or deprive our characters of freedom is all well and good, but it's the human connection that makes a final boss really sing. As a counterexample, in the DLC, Hammerhead was not a satisfying final boss for this reason. Yuri or Black Cat would have been stronger because they have a connection to Peter, but Hammerhead was just a mob boss who turned himself into a monster and had to be put down for the safety of everyone living in New York. It's Peter's connection to Otto and how that leads to the final encounter with Doc Ock and the fallout afterwards that will stick with me and make me look back on my time with Marvel's Spider-Man fondly. So much so that I look forward to eventually playing Miles Morales and Spider-Man 2, hoping that they contain a similar setup and payoff to make them just as memorable. Thanks for watching. And that's the end of another video. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you enjoy the video, why not become a patron? I have a paid tier, which gives you early access to the videos, the ability to vote in any poll I put out, and I often write about the games I complete in my spare time. If you just like access to the monthly updates I write, that's available for everyone in the free tier. Now usually at the end of these videos I will do a section I call deleted scenes, where I talk about ideas I had for the video but I had to take out either because they didn't fit or it just became too big and I got off topic. You know, that happens. So what I did with the previous video this year, the 2024 impressions video, a week after I released that, I wrote a post-mortem which I posted over on my Patreon. And what I want to do for the deleted scenes going forward is to include those in the post-mortem. So if you were interested in that section of the video where I went into everything I couldn't put in the main video, those will be in the post-mortem now. Now here's where I usually talk about what games are coming up next in the poll. But seeing as I'm phasing out the polls and there's only 2 games left to choose, I thought instead of going right into the final poll, I'd take a detour and talk about another game I completed back in December that I want to make a video on. So the poll will be coming after the next video, but the next video will be a critique on Super Mario Odyssey. Yes, it's taken, that's like 7 years since it came out, I think. But I finally played it, and I have thoughts about it, so that's what that video is going to be. So until next time, I hope you enjoyed the video. Please let me know what you think in the comments. I hope you're all well, I hope you're enjoying your gaming, and I hope you're all having a wonderful day.